Thanks so much for the invitation and the conference organizers. Say no. I'm very happy to be here. So obviously fluids in subduction zones are really important for the geochemical and geodynamic evolution of the planet. And there are many ways to get at that information. And our contribution has been to look at lawsonite. I did not see lawsonite in the word cloud, I'm pretty sure. Which just reflects what this meeting, the abstracts are. I hope it doesn't reflect general opinion about lawsonite. But I'm just curious. I won't ask you to compare with garnet, but how many of you would put lawsonite somewhere in the top, I don't know, 3 to 5 most exciting and important minerals in the world? Oh, wow. I'm sorry I am, but so the first part of this talk, its introduction, is to explain why you should raise your hand for that question. But clearly the story of water in subduction zones starts before subduction with the hydration of the crust and the upper mantle, as well as sediments. And then, I mean, at least when we teach, we talk about just dehydration, right, as during subduction as a simple story. But clearly it's more complex than that because you know, there's fluids moving around, there's fluids at different structural levels of the subducted plate. And so the slab mantle interface is a very dynamic area with deformation and fluids coming potentially from different sources that are interacting. And all of that's important because that fluid, you know, can carry elements into the mantle and then affect, you know, the overriding plate. And other, of course, parts of the subduction zone continue into the deep mantle and contribute to recycling in a different, longer timescale way. We're going to be looking in particular at blueschist and eclogites that contain lawsonite from near the top of the slab, particularly, at least for lawsonite eclogites that I'll mention from the deep forearc to subarc depths. And at this really geodynamically important area where the plate's behavior changes from one of sort of decoupled, where there's the serpentinite above it, to more coupled below that depth. Okay, and so, you know, one way to look at water in subduction zones, of course, is to model it, phase equilibrium modeling. There have been various important studies on that. And just to get into the question about water and to give context for the lawsonite work I'll talk about, I just wanted to look at this classic work where we can see, for example, that, should we let them in? Yes. For cold subduction zones, at about that 80 kilometers depth for that decoupling zone, we have greenschist blueschist transition predicted, and for slightly warmer subduction zones, blueschist eclogite. In terms of the phase assemblage, depending on assumptions about the starting material, lawsonite is predicted at both of these conditions near the slab mantle interface. And the water amounts are interesting in terms of what's predicted. You know, you can see on this scale, you know, fairly low water contents, and here, you know, similar. So we're talking a couple of weight percent water predicted. Well, lawsonite contains a lot of water. It's part of why it's so important. It contains both hydroxyl and molecular water, nearly 12 weight percent. It can be modally very important part of the rock, and it's got it occurs over a wide range of depths in these sort of cold intermediate subduction zones. So if you have a lot of lawsonite, there's a lot of water in the rock. And this is an eclogite facies metagabbro. And pretty much all the plagioclase that was in the protolith has transformed to lawsonite. And lawsonite can occur not only in the mafic rocks, the metabasalts and metagabbros, but also in metacherts and calcsilicates. And it's also common in metasomatic rocks. All this white stuff here is lawsonite. And so in many subducted lithologies, lawsonite is again, occurs or is predicted. Well, how much water? Let's compare it to those calculations I just showed you. If we look at analyses for exhumed subduction rocks, we see that epidote blueschists and eclogites sort of plot in here, kind of what you might predict for subducted altered oceanic crust. But lawsonite-bearing blueschist and eclogites can contain substantially more water. And so, these aren't necessarily closed systems. There's a lot of fluid moving around in the subduction zone. And so we started to develop questions about lawsonite in terms of, well, what is the fluid that's in the lawsonite? Where does it come from? And does lawsonite represent, does it record the sources of that fluid? So water is a big part of the story with lawsonite. Lawsonite is also a major host of other elements that are important, both for just element cycling in the earth, as well as tracking various processes through subduction to mantle to arc and continent. It contain, depending on what other minerals are present in the rock, it contain large amounts of the lead and uranium and strontium and other important trace elements. So all these kind of yellowish colors here, depending on rock type, are elements that are in lawsonite. Well, where the lawsonite rocks come from, I took this PT diagram, put on about 300 PT estimates from the literature. Here's the lawsonite out reaction. Epidote is on the other side, epidote group minerals. If we look at lawsonite eclogites that have lawsonite in the matrix, they plot, with one exception, or two exceptions really, they plot right on predicted slab mantle interface conditions for cold to intermediate subduction zones. Blueschists are all over the place, but at least we have an idea that these lawsonite eclogites with matrix lawsonite preserved are really good recorders of slab mantle interface conditions. I put on here, actually it's interesting, one of the exceptions down here is from the Dominican Republic, where I have not worked myself, but just from the literature, these are the blueschist and eclogite conditions from that one complex. And it's just a reminder that, when you have PT conditions from a rock, maybe it's not peak, maybe it's retrograde, maybe there's all sorts of things that could represent. We have to be really careful when we talk about the PT conditions of a subduction zone from the geologic record in terms of what's recorded. And this is actually a similar diagram, but Peter Van Kecken recently asked me for my figure, and then he put on it the latest, greatest slab surface conditions that he just calculated. And again, you can see a really nice correspondence for the lawsonite eclogites. So we think when we look at eclogites that have preserved lawsonite in it, we're getting a really good record of the metamorphic and deformation processes at this critical area in subduction zones. Just a quick point, lawsonite, aside from all these geochemical reasons why it's important, to also just the presence of the lawsonite, the modal abundance, all sorts of textural features, affects the geophysical parameters of the subducted plate, at least the oceanic crust part. And so it affects seismic velocity. It also affects anisotropy. And there's all sorts of interesting questions about that. And as lawsonite participates in dehydration reactions, not just the lawsonite out, but throughout the prograde subduction history, its dehydration, along with other hydrous minerals, has been at least proposed to contribute to intermediate depth earthquakes, though there's of course ongoing debate about that. You can date lawsonite. There's been some interesting lutetium-hafnium studies. This is from Mulcahy et al., who dated both Franciscan lawsonite blueschist, as well as some rocks that we sent the group from our field site in Sivrihisar, Turkey. And what was interesting actually is they got similar results for their lutetium-hafnium results as we got for phengite, argon, and kind of supported the idea that the blueschists in fact were retrograde relative to the eclogites, at least some of them. Other isotopic studies of lawsonite, not just geochronology, but more as a geochemical indicator of processes. There's been some great work in the Guatemala area by Tatsuki Sujimori's group. In fact, showing that the strontium and lead isotopes reflect not only the protolith, but also the contributions of external fluids. And that's sort of what we've been looking at too with other methods for lawsonite. And they've proposed this as a method for tracking what the external fluid sources were and how they might have changed through time. So I'm sort of showing you some complex figures here and not really explaining them, but the point is there's lots of things we can do with lawsonite that give us important information about the environment of subduction zones. And just a quick point about time, The oldest lawsonite in the world that's been determined is not too far from here in Anglesey. If anyone has a piece of this, I want it, please. And we can see here, yeah, both lawsonite, blueschists, and eclogites occurring from the Neoproterozoic up to fairly recently. Okay, so those are all the reasons why lawsonite is an amazing, significant mineral. So I hope we convinced a few of you of that. I think everyone should know about lawsonite. We wrote a review paper a couple of years ago, and then afterwards we kind of reconfigured the paper for this science journal for kids. And so it's about, subduction zone and recycling, but it's a stealth paper on lawsonite, trying to get to the 8 to 15-year-olds. This is a really great journal. There's not a lot of earth science in it, and so I highly encourage you to take a look at it and to help fix that. Okay, well, as is well known, lawsonite doesn't do very well surviving subduction and exhumation. It's probably most famous for its pseudomorphs, which are great to know that lawsonite used to be there, but are not useful to me because I want to analyze the lawsonite. So pseudomorphs, great, but yeah, I want the lawsonite rocks. And so we've been looking at lawsonite from eclogites and blueschists from different parts of the world, looking at matrix lawsonite, inclusion lawsonite, vein lawsonite, and trying to understand what the composition means in terms of subduction processes. So I believe that there are 16 eclogites with preserved lawsonite, where the lawsonite is at least convincingly, to me, in equilibrium with omphacite and garnet. There may be more, but this is what we've come up with so far. And so we've analyzed these here. I'll be showing you results from these, in some cases supplemented with literature data from other samples that we don't have in our collection. Okay, so we've analyzed the different rock types, different facies, the different textural sites, and also different field settings, melange versus more structurally coherent sequences. And as I said, we're trying to get at this question of, well, what does the lawsonite composition mean? And what can it tell us about subduction fluids? And just, I mentioned the field setting, and so just to give a picture for that, this would be structurally more coherent, this would be melange, and this is, I think, a complicated question because many subduction complexes contain elements of both. Some are pretty much just one, but you sort of need to know where you are. Lawsonite occurs in both types of settings. Okay, so lawsonite commonly contains first row transition elements, and in some cases substantial amounts. And these mostly substitute for aluminum, which indicates, at least for iron, that it's probably ferric iron, which is interesting for redox questions. And we can see here that these are commonly zoned, and sometimes spectacularly so. Chromium very commonly is oscillatory zoned, and this is all the same crystal here. You can see that titanium, in contrast, is crystallographically controlled in its zoning and has commonly this hourglass zoning, although it can also display other types of zoning. Because of the crystallographic control and the titanium zoning, you really need to know the crystallographic orientation of your crystal and how your thin section intersects that to really interpret the zoning. Other trace elements we've been looking at, turns out strontium and lead, and also, I won't show it, but chromium and vanadium ratios are important indicators. They mostly track the protolith type. You can see metasediments versus the more mafic rocks here, but and of course it's important to know what other minerals are in the rock. If there's sulfides that are taking lead relative to lawsonite, that affects these trends. But we can also, in some cases, the trends do indicate some open system behavior. Similarly, rare earth elements give us indications of petrogenesis, what other minerals were present, and also probably are good indicators of reaction history. This interesting result from Martin et al. For Corsica, they proposed that the difference in, lawsonite rare earth element abundance, but these europium anomalies was telling you that the core was blueschist facies and the rim was eclogite facies. The europium anomaly can be also controlled by other factors, such as redox, but possibly also something about the plagioclase coexistence. We saw the opposite trend in Sivrisar, Turkey, indicating possible eclogite facies core and a blueschist facies rim, which is consistent with those geochronology results I showed you briefly a few slides ago, that eclogite was retrogressed to a blueschist in the lawsonite stability field. Okay, so how are we doing with these sort of research questions? I think we've gotten some insights up to this point from all these other elements I've shown you about the other sources, but we wanted to try to do better. I'll show you with the rest of the talk. And we were seeing in both structurally coherent terrains and melanges that there was a lot of water in both. Hydrous eclogites, just a lot of water, but possibly some systematic differences in lawsonite composition that I'll bring home that point with the next part of the talk. So we decided to look at oxygen isotopes in lawsonite and see if that was a good indicator, along with all these other geochemical things we were looking at. What does the oxygen isotope composition of lawsonite indicate about what the lawsonite is interacting with?